Amen. I just want to say thank you to our band. I mean, that was just such a moving experience. I also have to say, Matthew on bass and Justin, this is their first time playing here, so we're just so glad that you guys are playing with us. And we are so glad that you have joined us this morning. Thank you for supporting Paradox by donating through paradoxgiving.com. Every week I am blown away by your generosity, and it enables this work to happen week in and week out. We are going through the Bible, and if this is your first time here at Paradox, I want to say welcome. I'm glad that you're here. One thing that's different about Paradox than other churches is here sermons are designed to start discussions and not end them. And that's really important because you're probably going to disagree with something I say here in the next few minutes, and that's fine. We welcome disagreement. We want you to think critically about what you believe, thoughtfully about what you believe, all in an effort to become a more loving person, loving of yourself, loving of others, and loving toward God. Now, this week was a bit of a chaotic week for me, and I kept trying to write a brand new sermon for you this week, and I have to tell you, there's some weeks it just doesn't happen. So we're going to the repeat files this week. I'm going to do a sermon from the Gospel of John. It's called John Loves the Word. And I have to tell you, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I heard this one, can you give me some new content, please? I will tell you that I am really impressed with you because I gave this sermon on December 7, 2019, and if you can remember anything before 2020, you blow me away, is all I can say, right? Also, I watched the video of this sermon in preparation for this sermon, and I just looked at myself with this expression of, that kid's adorable. Because at this point, we're just a few weeks away from 2020, and I can just sense that this guy's excited, just saying, I am really looking forward to 2020. You're like, you have no idea, man. No idea what's in store for you. Now, the question could be, why did you pick this book of the Bible or this particular sermon when you could go back and pick any sermon? The reason why is because I don't know about you, but there's some things to be anxious about in the world right now, whether it's the climate crisis, the nuclear crisis, or just personal crises that you may be facing in general. I have found that one of the best things to do is to go back to the Gospel of John, which is a little deeper than Twitter, and find this book and go back to it and read it on a regular basis. I want to tell you that I highly recommend reading the book of John over this weekend. And this sermon serves as an introduction and is for anyone who has a desire to read the Bible, start in John. And this sermon is meant to give you an overview and an introduction about what this entire book is about. So if you are so inspired, I would invite you to read the book of John over the weekend, and may it help with any anxiety that you may be feeling. So with that, we turn to John Loves the Word. Now, I went to school at a place called Montana State University. When I tell people that in California, they said, I did not know that Fontana had a state university. It's like, no, Montana State University. And it's hard to believe, but I went to school in this paradise. Yes, it is as beautiful as it looks here. And you may have heard of us. We are the home of the Fighting Bobcats. And what's interesting about the Bobcats is just yesterday was a big day for Bobcat athletics because it was the first time ever that both the men's and women's basketball team played in the NCAA March Madness tournament, right? This is a big deal for the Bobcats, right? And you may ask, how did it go? This all happened in one day yesterday. Well, the men played the Texas Tech Raiders, and we only lost by 35, which is pretty good for us. And then the women played the Stanford Cardinal, and they lost by 41. So, we lost by a combined 76 points. It was a great day for Bobcat history yesterday. Thank you, yes. I have no idea what you're clapping for, but thank you. Anyways, when I was a third-year student at Montana State University, I had the opportunity to study architecture while traveling abroad, and I got to travel with these 9 wonderful people across Europe, and it was just fantastic. We went to Turkey, Italy, and Greece. And I remember one time I was in Italy with my classmates, and we were looking at Brunelleschi's Duomo, which is in Florence. And anybody who's been to Florence will recognize this building. It's the most iconic building in Florence. And I remember shortly after I took this picture, one of my classmates, who we will call Kyle for the purposes of this story, leaned over to me and he said, "So Craig, you're religious, right?" I said, "Yes, Kyle, you know this." And then he said, "What can't you do?" I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, you're religious. So like there's things that I do that you can't do. What are those things? And I was like, oh, interesting way to phrase this question. Now, I don't blame Kyle for asking this question. After all, if I were to ask you what the most famous rules in all the Bible are, what would you say they are? The 10 Commandments. Now, I believe this is an actual photograph of Moses. And when we think about the 10 Commandments, it's all about what you can't do, right? You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. 8.5 out of 10 of the commandments are about what humans shall not do. The 1.5 comes from the 5th commandment, which says, honor your father and mother. And the half commandment is from the 4th commandment, which is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then it lists a bunch of things that you can't do. So 85% of the commandments are about what you shouldn't do. So when Kyle comes to me and says, Craig, what can't you do? He's probably heard of the 10 Commandments at some point and said, so I guess that's what religion is. But what Kyle doesn't know is there are a lot more rules than just the 10 Commandments. And if you want to go to rules, then you should turn to the book of Leviticus, right? Now, Leviticus has some very interesting rules that are contained in its pages. If we go to Leviticus 19 with the question, what can't we do? Leviticus answers back, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. So when Kyle asked me, what can't you do? Well, Kyle, I can't allow my dog to breed with my fish. That's what we can't do. Not only that, but it gets even stranger or more graphic in its descriptions. We read in Leviticus 15, if a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and be unclean until the evening. Everything made of cloth or skin on which the semen falls shall be washed with water and be unclean until the evening. So when Kyle says, so Craig, what can't you do? I'll just stop right there. We'll keep reading. In Leviticus 15, when a woman has a discharge of blood that is a regular discharge from her body, she shall be in her impurity for 7 days. Now you may say, wait a second, why is the man only impure for 1 day and the woman is impure for 7 days? The answer is very simple, because men wrote the Bible. And when men write the Bible, they hear God saying things that are beneficial to men, which is why it's important to include women's writings, theology, and thought in the way that we understand and perceive God, specifically in the Bible, the book of Song of Solomon. So we keep reading here what happens. Everything upon which she lies during her impurity shall be unclean. Everything also upon which she sits shall be unclean. And you may say to yourself, I don't know if I want to keep that rule. Who is it that said this? Well, it's God speaking directly to Moses according to Leviticus. And if you go through all of the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians refer to as the Old Testament, you could start counting all the things that you should not do, and you would find that there are 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. So when Kyle asks me on top of a roof in Florence, Italy, what can't you do? I could have responded with 613 things. And when you hear these words, if you are new to Christianity, if you don't identify as Christian at all, if you think to yourself, what is this? I wasn't aware of 612 of these commandments. You may be saying to yourself, what is it that we can do about these rules? Some Christians respond to 613 rules by saying, oh, how can I keep more of these rules to show that I am utterly devoted to God? Now, atheists and agnostics who are here today may hear this and say, why would I ever want to be part of an organized religion with over 613 rules of things I can't do? And there are some of us who are in between these ideas, and we may ask a question like, well, I know the Bible is important, but these commandments given to us by God are commandments that I do not want to keep. So what am I supposed to do? And if you feel like you resonate with any of those responses to finding out there are 613 commandments in the Bible, then I have some good news for you. John chapter 1 is written specifically for you. Now, John was written probably the latest of the 4 Gospels, several decades after the death of Christ. It is attributed to the disciple and later the apostle known as John, who was considered the youngest disciple. Not only that, but John lived longer than all of the other disciples. He was the last living witness of Christ. And as he writes his gospel, it's important to acknowledge that he has 3 audiences in mind when he's writing the words about who Jesus was. We have to pay attention to all three of those to understand what is in the Gospel of John. The first audience that that John writes to is the Jews. Now, John himself is Jewish, so he is writing to his own people, and he has that in mind as he is telling them about who Jesus is. His second audience is the Gentiles, which basically means anyone who is non-Jewish. Specifically, in John's mind, he is thinking of Greco-Roman Gentiles because he is writing in Greek, and he is speaking to people not only within his own people group, but people he interacts with on a daily basis outside of his own people group. Now, the third audience is very different than these other two audiences because John had no idea that he had this third audience in mind when he was writing this gospel. Now, the third audience is the Californians. Now, John, upon hearing this, if he was here with us today, he would respond by saying, "What the discus is a Californian?" Because he has no idea, right, living 2,000 years ago, that California will one day be talking about his words, but here we are. So we are the Californians, and just to prove it and just to feel like we're home, can I hear you say, "Let's go get on the 10"? Oh, I'm home. I love those words, right? So John had no idea we'd be talking about this, and here we are. So let's talk about how these intended audiences and unintended audiences influence the way we read and perceive what John is saying. We read in John 1:1, "In the beginning." Does this remind anyone of any other passage of Scripture? Yes, which one? Genesis 1:1, right? Genesis 1:1 reads, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth." So when John writes "in the beginning," Jewish people would respond by saying, "Oh, he's referencing Genesis. I know where this goes. He's going to tell us in the beginning there was God." But then John takes a bit of a left turn by changing it just a little bit, and he says, "In the beginning was the Word." Now, the Hebrew word for word is devar. Let me hear you say devar this morning. Now, what's interesting about ancient Hebrew is that the vocabulary of ancient Hebrew had about 10,000 words in its lexicon. Today, modern English has about 170,000 words. So the words back in John's day had to cover a lot more ground than our words do today. This is evidenced by the fact that the Hebrew word for thing is also devar. And so devar means either thing or word. Now, you can see how this language plays out in the theology of Genesis chapter 1, because how is it that God creates things? Well, God creates things by speaking words. And so God speaks a word, a devar, to create a thing, which is light, which is the word devar. It makes sense from a theological perspective that God's words would create itself into things. So here we have, in the beginning was the Word. And when the Jews read the Word, it meant far more to them than just the Word. It meant God's own voice being able to speak things into existence. Now, from there, we turn to the Greco-Roman Gentiles and how they would have heard this first passage here. They would have heard, "In the beginning was the Word." Now, the Greek word for word is logos. Let me hear you say logos this morning. Now, logos does not just mean word, it also means reason. And this was a big deal in Greek philosophy. So much so that if you read the writings of Heraclitus, who lived centuries before Jesus Christ, you can read about how he thought about this concept of logos. He writes, "Listening not to me, but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one." 500 years before Christ, there is a Greek philosopher who says the reason for everything is interconnected relationships. A few centuries later was a man named Aristotle, who you've probably heard of before. And I come across an author, Paul Anthony Raw, who tells us what Aristotle thought about the word logos in Greek philosophy. He writes, "For Aristotle, logos is something more refined than the capacity to make private feelings public. Logos enables the human being to perform as no other animal can." So if we could ask Aristotle, what's the difference between a dog and a human, he would say, logos. The author goes on to say, "Logos makes it possible for him to perceive and make clear to others through reasoned discourse the difference between what is advantageous and what is harmful, between what is just and what is unjust, and between what is good and what is evil." So when John writes, in the beginning was Logos, those who were Gentiles would have heard this and their ears would have perked up and he would have said, oh, he's validating our philosophy. He's validating the reason we think things exist here as well. And when the Gentiles read the word, it meant far more to them than just the word. And John, in a stroke of literary genius, is able to address both of his attended audiences in just a few words. Which brings us to the Californians. We read here, in the beginning was the Word. And if you identify as Christian and you know this background, then it's important for Christians to acknowledge that when we read the Word today, we need to make sure that it means more to us than just the Word. If we just read it as the Word, we're missing the point because John had much grander aspirations than just writing the Word there. Now, if I was speaking exclusively to Christians, I would go back to the Bible and I would say to those Christians, why is the Bible important? And the overwhelming response from Christianity, the majority would say, oh, the Bible's important because it is inspired. And so if John was writing exclusively to Christians, I believe that he would write, in the beginning was the Word. I think he would change it to read, in the beginning was the inspiration. You know that thing that makes you feel like the Bible is something special? That was there in the beginning of time. But John doesn't just write to Christians. John writes to everyone in this gospel. And if he could somehow see who paradox is, he would see atheists here, he would see agnostics, he would see Christians, he would see people who identify with other religions, all sitting side by side, trying to understand who God is here in this community. And I think that if John was writing to us specifically his gospel, I think he would change something. If he wrote to us today, I think he would use a different word here. And I think, this is my best guess, I think John would write to us, in the beginning was the Big Bang. And now you know why people call me a heretic. And I tell you all of these things because when we talk about this word, in the beginning was Logos, we have to recognize that John is going so much bigger than just a concrete word we write on a page or a word that we say to one another. And from here, there is just pure poetry. And I have to tell you, I get emotional reading this part because John 1 is one of my favorite passages of Scripture. We read, in the beginning was Logos, and Logos was with God, and Logos was God. Christ was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through Christ, and without Christ, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in Christ was life. And the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. A few verses later, he then writes his thesis statement for the entire Gospel of John when he says, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. Whew. You want to talk about poetry? I can barely read this without tearing up because it is so beautiful. It is so moving. It is so poetic in the way that this thing moves from the idea of in the beginning there was Logos. And when you think about what John is trying to describe, he is essentially trying to describe the Christmas story. He's trying to tell us what it means that Jesus Christ was born here on this planet. And the best that I can do and the best that I can tell you about what John believes about this baby is that John believes that whatever you consider to be the animating substance of the entire universe took on flesh and blood in this tiny, fragile baby. But if you read the words of John closely, you say to yourself, oh, no, Craig, it's much bigger than that. Because all things came into being through Christ. So it's not just one baby. John believes that whatever you consider to be the animating substance of the entire universe took on flesh and blood in every tiny, fragile baby. Because every baby bears the image of Christ. And so when John talks about what it means to understand Jesus Christ, he's saying there is this temporary thing and there is this eternal thing, and they meet together and somehow coexist. It's very paradoxical in nature. And we read the words, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. And from there, we then hear about this baby growing up and living among people and learning what it was like to be human in the fullest capacity possible. We read for 14 chapters until we get to the end of Jesus' life when he sits down with his closest friends around a table and shares his last meal with them. Knowing that his death is imminent, Jesus looks at his disciples in the eye and he's thinking to himself, what can I share with these men, with these women who are also at the table? And man, what can I give them that they will remember about what matters here in life? And he says to him these words, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Now, I picture when he started this by saying, I give you a new commandment. The 12 Jewish disciples around him said, oh no, now we have to do 614 rules? But when you read what Jesus is saying, he's saying, no. I'm replacing or I am summarizing all of those rules into one. All you have to do is love one another. And if you think that this is a small deal, let me be very transparent. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. If you have love for one another. You don't have to take people to a Bible study. You don't have to tell people you're a Christian. You don't have to tell people that you know God. As long as you love the person next to you, particularly if they are different than you, then that is all the testimony Jesus asks us to do. And when you consider this story and how grand John thinks this life of Jesus Christ is, John goes on to say, this is a summary, he says, Jesus Christ is what every theological word, every religious doctrine, and every holy commandment looks like in tangible flesh and blood. You want to know what it matters? What laws matter in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible? Look at what Jesus prioritized and see how it played out in his life. Well, what about keeping Sabbath? How important is that? Look at how Jesus kept Sabbath. Because all of those rules exist to help us to be more loving toward other people and toward ourselves. Amen. Now, here's what's fascinating about the book of John, and I hope you take some time to read it this weekend. The book of John is structured around 7 miracles of Jesus. And it starts with what seems to be a very small miracle, and then it crescendos toward the end with a very big miracle. And so there's some real thought into the order of this story. And when we go through these miracles about that Jesus committed, we find that we can learn a lot about the character of Christ. Now, religion will often ask you, but do you believe the miracles occurred? Because that's the most important part. I've found that question is not that interesting to answer. I think there are much more interesting questions that we can ask along the way. So let's go through each miracle and ask how all of these religious doctrines, theological words, and holy commandments look in tangible flesh and blood. The first commandment takes place in John chapter 2. Jesus goes to a wedding. Anytime you go to a wedding, you are living the Christ experience. Every wedding you go to is exactly where Jesus went. Now, he is there. He's having a good time. Things are going well. It's a wedding that goes on for days, literally. And toward the end of the wedding, they run out of wine. So they go to Jesus, and they ask Jesus, hey, can you help us in any way, shape, or form? And Jesus creates water or turns water into wine. And when you look at what this miracle is telling us, is it is telling us that Jesus stayed at a wedding and also enjoyed the wedding. And so if we really want to follow Christ, when we go to weddings, it's our job to enjoy it. It's our job to have a great time. And if you go to a wedding and you say, oh, I hope this one is short, you are going the opposite direction of Jesus Christ, right? Now, let's imagine that my friend Kyle asked me on a rooftop in Florence, what can't you do? Could I have responded, well, Kyle, I can't go to a wedding and be miserable. I can't go to a wedding and not enjoy it. I have to have a good time. Kyle would say, where did you get that idea from? I'm like, Jesus Christ. The second miracle of Jesus takes place a few chapters later. Now, there's a royal official who comes before Jesus and begs him to heal his son. Now, it's important to understand who a royal official was and who Jesus Christ was. The royal official served King Herod, and King Herod was corrupt. So corrupt, in fact, that he often taxed the Jewish people straight into poverty. I've seen estimates as low as 70% and as high as 90% of most Jewish people's income was taxed by the government between the Roman government and the Jewish government. So what's important for us to understand is that this man is part of the system that oppresses Jesus. Now imagine, just try to imagine, that there's someone in the White House that you don't like. And someone that is related to the person who is in the White House comes to you asking you for help. How would you respond? That's what this story is about. And when you think about that, and the fact that Jesus decides to help this man anyways, you got to say to yourself, wow, I don't know if I could do that. A lot of you here are in healthcare, and you know that you have to do that, right? You can't deny care to someone you disagree with. But that standard was set by Jesus long ago because this is the highest ethical form of taking care of someone else. So let's imagine that Kyle, on top of a roof in Florence, says to me, Craig, what can't you do? Well, Kyle, I can't avoid helping someone who's in need if they disagree with me. I can't view someone as my enemy to the point where I won't help them if they ask me for help. I imagine Kyle would say, that sounds difficult. I would say, yeah, it's very difficult. But that's what my religion asks me to do. The third miracle of Jesus takes place in the next chapter. Jesus is going to the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. On his way, he sees a man who has been disabled, and he has been disabled for 38 years, which is my entire lifetime. Jesus sees him, watches him for a moment, and there are people rushing in the pool and rushing out of the pool, and nobody pays this disabled person any mind. This man is completely forgotten by society. People run by him without a second thought. Jesus walks straight up to him and asks him, do you want to be well? The person who's disabled says, yeah. And he stands up then, picks up his mat, and walks away. Now, the big scandal of this miracle is that Jesus did this on the Sabbath. And this made the religious people very upset because you're not supposed to heal people on the Sabbath. And think about the story from their perspective. They're thinking to Jesus, this guy's been here for 38 years. Could you just wait a day and make everyone happy? And Jesus says, no, I can't wait. This person is in need and needs help now. And so when Kyle asks me on a rooftop, Craig, what can't you do? I would respond, well, I can't put my religion over the help of another person. I cannot allow the religious laws to be an excuse to look the other way of suffering. So if you want to know what I can't do, I can't turn a blind eye to someone suffering and say, oh, well, I'm keeping my religion, so it's okay. The next miracle takes place in John chapter 6. Now we read there are 5,000 men there, which implies that there's even more people there because there's more people than men. I don't know how to say that. So in other words, there are thousands of people who are hungry, right? And Jesus sees all of them, and it's important for us to understand that Jesus is a poor and oppressed Jew at this point, right? He has been for his whole life. And if you're poor and oppressed, chances are you go to bed hungry frequently. And so yes, there's a miracle where Jesus feeds thousands of people. But don't miss that detail at the end. The fact is they had bags of food left over, and everyone got to eat until they were full. If Kyle were to ask me, Craig, what can't you do? I would say I can't allow my guests to go home hungry. Not only that, beyond my guests, I can't allow the people around me to go home hungry, to go to bed at night hungry. I have to work to end hunger in the context I live in. That's what I can't do. The next miracle takes place just a few verses later where Jesus walks on water. We love this miracle in the Christian church because it's almost like Jesus is a Marvel superhero, right? It's like, wow, he can bend the laws of physics. But understand this miracle as a metaphor for just a moment. There is a storm, and there are people who are afraid. And Jesus walks on water, and he speaks to the people who are afraid in the middle of the storm. And what does he say? He does not say, check it out, it's cool, I can walk on water. What he says is, it is I in the middle of the storm. Do not be afraid. If Kyle were to ask me, what can't you do? I would say, well, Kyle, when people are anxious, when they're scared, when they're living in fear, I can't just ignore that. I can't add to their anxiety. I am called to be a calming presence to myself and to the people I love and to the people who are worried, because we can live at a level that is above fear. The sixth miracle takes place in John chapter 9. Jesus Christ comes across a person who is born blind. Now, this is a big theological idea back in Jesus' day, because if you are born blind, you are viewed to be cursed by the religious people. The reason for this is because all suffering was connected to God in their theology, and God only allowed those who deserved to suffer to suffer. Now, if you were born blind, that raised a theological question. Who sinned, this blind man or his parents? And it's important for us to understand in that question, this man is considered to be the living sin. And so Jesus sees this man, and his disciples ask him the theological question of the day. Who sinned, this man or his parents? And do you remember Jesus' response? Neither. This man was born for the glory of God. Now, Christians have interpreted that to say that he was given blindness so God could heal him. Can we cut that out? That is a terrible interpretation of what Jesus said. Jesus said, no. He wasn't born in sin. He was born in glory. And when we ask this question, Craig, what can't you do? Well, I can't deny the image of Christ in anyone, Kyle. I can't say that anyone is sinful because they're all born in the glory of God. I have to affirm that in every person I encounter, even when it's inconvenient. Which brings us to the seventh miracle of Jesus in John chapter 11, where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And I know it's a story that many people have heard. Jesus' friend dies, he raises him from the dead, and most Christians rush to that part because they're uncomfortable with what happens before then. Right before Jesus raises him from the dead, we read that Jesus begins to weep. And of course he does. He's at a funeral. He's crying because Lazarus meant something to him. He loved Lazarus, which is why it hurt. And so when Kyle asks me, Craig, what can't you do? Well, Kyle, I can't go to a funeral and be indifferent. I can't go to a funeral and just hold it all in and act like I'm too tough for this. I can go to funerals and weep openly and bitterly because I believe the tears that I experience are in the presence of God. And when you look at the life of Jesus, you realize it starts at a wedding and ends at a funeral. And there's a lot of life that happens in between. And you realize that this is a story about what it means to be human. And along every step of the way, there are miracles, but there are stories about humanity interwoven with the miracles, which is pretty much the life we're living today, right? There are few words better in Scripture than these, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. We are called to be people who continue to take the words of Scripture, the words of Christ, the words of God, and to put it into breathing, tangible flesh that makes sense and is rooted in love. I go back to this crazy rooftop, taking this picture with Kyle saying, Craig, what can't you do? And I guarantee you my answer was terrible back in 2007. I think I listed a bunch of things and it was an awkward conversation. Let's all never answer that question that way, shall we? If I could go back and answer that question though, I would say to Kyle, it's pretty simple, Kyle. I can't do anything that prevents me from love. That's it. That's what my religion restricts me from. My friends, may we follow the new commandment of Jesus Christ and love extravagantly just as Jesus loved. And may you see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, in yourself, in the person next to you, in the person you disagree with, in your enemy, and in the people you have not yet met. And may you love God for giving you this strange and beautiful mystery called life. May you love just as Jesus loved. Amen.